Thank you, Leon, and welcome to you all. It's a pleasure to be here. It's Hannah Arendt's 115th birthday today, so happy birthday to her. And it's simply great to be back in person with an audience, with people convening to talk about important issues. The title of our conference, as you see, is Revitalizing American Democracy, or Revitalizing Democracy, sorry about that, Sortition, Citizen Power, and Spaces of Freedom. And the title is really an attempt to talk to the sortition community, the group of people, the activists around the world who are seeking to revitalize democracy, and put them in conversation with a different tradition, an Arendtian tradition, a tradition that we might also call civic republicanism of some sort, American republicanism of some sort. And so we have, over the next 2 days, a really excellent and wide range of speakers coming to think about what it would mean to revitalize democracies today, assuming I think we all agree that they need to be revitalized. There is a story told about sortition, and by sortition I simply mean it's a technical word that speaks to the tradition of picking representatives, democratic representatives, by lottery. A tradition that started in Greece, was continued in the Roman and Italian city-states, and then was largely assumed by almost every political thinker in history, from Aristotle to Rousseau to Montesquieu, to be the way that democracies pick their representatives. Election, voting, was thought to be the way aristocracies pick their representatives. And it's for a very simple reason, that if you vote, generally you'll vote for people who have the virtue, the money, the education, the status, that they seem to be qualified. And that will lend to a certain elite being elected. And so the idea was that elites would be elected, and if you wanted the people to govern, as democracy is governance of the people, you would want to bring in people who wouldn't normally be elected by others, and lottery was the most fair and easy way to do that. In this story, to have democracy ruled by the people, you needed to choose the representatives by lottery. And now this identification of democracy with lottery is in the story that is told by the folks who are pushing sortition, and I fully believe sortition and citizen assemblies are a deeply important part of how we think about revitalizing our democracy. This identification of democracy with lottery really lasted until the United States Constitution. And, the U.S. founding fathers were suspicious of democracy. So they embraced, in the story, the aristocratic practices of elections, the Electoral College, constitutional limitation. And somehow, this was seen as the turning point. Sortition disappeared from the political stage, and democracy was betrayed. And today, the movement in sortition is seen as a movement to bring back, against elections, to bring back democracy. Now, I generally find this story persuasive. I think it's an important story, and yet I want to challenge parts of it. Most specifically, I want to question the all too easy association of civic assemblies with democracy. I've been teaching 2 courses this semester. One is a course with one of our keynote speakers who will be speaking right after me, David Van Raybroek, and we've been helping students design civic assemblies for 3 local towns. And one of the things you learn is how much effort and science and intellectual rigor goes into picking who's going to actually be selected. How do we do these random selections? What's the structure? What are the experts, etc.? These are designed and run by social scientists, by people we might call elites. They're designed to correct for randomness. They're not simply purely random. And so and they're moderated with facilitators. And so we have to understand that the citizen assembly movement, which is growing around the world, is not a democratic movement in the sense of bringing back direct democracy, bringing back, just people governing. It's rather a movement to re-engage citizens in the active practice of self-government. And that movement, the active practice of self-government, is not, I think, necessarily democratic, or at least within the tradition of American democracy, it's more accurately described as one of civic republicanism. Republicanism understood as the idea that people should govern themselves, that power lays in the people, and that we should also limit those people through things like a constitution that limits majority rule, and through mechanisms that take self-interested, passionate people and try and give them incentives to actually work in the public interest. And so the other course that I'm teaching this semester is constitutional law. And as I've been teaching it, I've been really struck by the way in which citizen assemblies and the sortition movement, in many ways, is an attempt to resurrect many of the ideas that the U.S. Constitution sought to embody, but I think has failed to over its 200 and some odd year history. So to start, let's remember that the United States Constitution is not a democratic constitution. It was a federal constitutional representative republic. It was imagined as republican, not democratic. Federal in that it was based in federalism. Constitutional in that it had a constitution that limited majority power. And representative, which meant that we elected representatives to govern us. It was not a democracy. In fact, many of the people, most of the people, at least the Federalists, who were the people who helped write the Constitution, really were scared of democracy. It's important to remember that people like James Madison said a republic, Alexander Hamilton said that it is impossible to read history of the petty republics of Greece and Italy without feeling sensations of horror and disgust at the state of perpetual vibration between the extremes of tyranny and anarchy. James Madison said much the same thing. We didn't want a democracy. There was a fear of mob rule. There was a fear that democracy, as Montesquieu had said, requires virtuous citizens. And we ran from the assumption that people weren't virtuous, that people were self-interested, passionate, and that democracies would lead to short-term failures that would lead to demagoguery. And so they sought to correct for and prevent what they saw as the evils of democracy, while still trying to hold on to the Republican tradition of self-government and people empowerment. And one of the ways they did that was through representation, the idea that you would have elites represent the people. It was important for them that the representation, the people being chosen were elites, and they wanted a large republic where the elites there would be well-qualified people, and they wanted them to be elected by election. And thus, as Madison writes, the elective mode of obtaining rulers is the characteristic policy of Republican government. They actually thought election would be good because it would help cure for some of the evils they saw in democracy. But the main fear that they had was that people would divide into factions. I mean, that's obvious. It happens. It's happening right now. The main faction through time has been the lenders and the debtors, the rich and the poor. But there are always different factions. And the worry that they had is that in a democratic country, one faction would take over and oppress the others. And the question was, how do you stop the great evil of politics, the dangerous vice of faction, as Madison wrote? And the obvious answers would be to restrict liberty, tell people what they have to do. But as Madison famously wrote in Federalist 10, liberty is to faction what air is to fire. As long as you're going to let people be free, you're going to have factions. As long as you let people have different viewpoints, people are going to have different viewpoints. You're not going to get rid of it. No amount of education, no amount of science is ever going to convince people to agree. This is one of the fundamental Arendtian insights into her politics, that people are plural. And all this attempt, people are constantly saying, if we just educated people, they would all agree to get a vaccine or wear a mask or whatever it is you want them to agree on. It doesn't work. Factions exist. And any government that doesn't take that into account is going to deny a kind of human nature. And so what the Federalists said is, okay, you can't take away the causes of faction. You have to mediate their effects. And there were two ways that they thought you could mediate the effects of faction. The first was you replace virtue, the fact that people were supposed to be virtuous in a republic, which is not the case, with size. And the idea is that if you extend the sphere and you take in a greater variety of parties and interests, you make it less probable that a majority of the whole will have a common motive to invade the rights of other citizens. Basically, you divide and conquer. There may be people who agree with this point, on masks and vaccines, but they don't agree on what we should do about China. And you prevent any one faction from emerging by multiplying the number of factions. You extend it. And that way you prevent one faction from tyrannizing and dominating another. The second approach that the Federalists took for the solution of the effects of faction was federalism, one of the most important parts of the United States Constitution. And so Madison again writes in Federalist 51, there are but two methods of providing against the evil of faction. One is to create a will in the community, independent of the majority, that is, of the society itself. Basically brainwash them, right? The other, by comprehending in the society so many separate descriptions of citizens as will render an unjust combination of majority of the whole very improbable. And the second method will be exemplified by the Federal Republic of the United States. The idea is you create so many different centers of power: the federal government, the Congress, the Supreme Court, the House, the Senate, the President, but also administrative agencies, but then 13 states, and then Congresses and people in those states, and then counties and towns, and then civic associations. You create so many different power sources that there is a multiplication of power, and there's no one ring that rules them all, right? To cite my favorite political philosopher. There's multiple rings, and since different people hold the different rings, different powers exist, you're not going to end up with tyranny. And this is based on this idea that in America, there was a particular experience of power. And it started with things like the Mayflower Compact. When people came over, they ended up in the wrong place, and before they landed, they set up a compact. Here's how we govern themselves. And Hannah Arendt, right, one of the great constitutional thinkers of the United States, what Hannah Arendt said is that what really separated the American Constitution and the American Revolution and the American Foundation was that at the basis of it was a new experience of power. That the people in the United States thought they had a right to govern themselves. And so in 1776, when they declared independence, within 4 years, all 13 states wrote and drafted constitutions. They're very different if you go and read the 13 constitutions, but they all thought they had that right to govern themselves. They had the right to create new centers of power. And that for Arendt, Madison's discovery of the federal principle was partly based upon an experience. This is the key idea for her, namely the experience of institutions whose principle was the further combinations of power. That's the Federalist principle. And she says that the American Revolution actually, what it did was to bring the new American experience and the new American concept of power out into the open. But Arendt was not some starry-eyed, American first person. She thinks that the American experiment failed. And I'm not going to read them all, but here are 3 quotes from her book On Revolution, where she talks about the failure of post-revolutionary thought to remember the revolutionary spirit and understand its foundation in power. and that Jefferson knew that it had failed to provide a space where this freedom could be exercised. And the failure of the founders to incorporate the township and the town hall meeting into the Constitution. The basic point here, the reason the Constitution failed to establish freedom, in Hannah Arendt's view, is that the fundamental experience of American power, which was found in townships, in the fact that people got together and talked to one another and governed themselves on local levels, that they felt that they had the right to and the responsibility to engage in the self-governing activity. The Constitution spent a lot of time creating mechanisms to prevent one faction from overcoming the other, but it didn't provide a space where people would come together and talk to one another. The one founder who really thought that that was important was Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson, who sought to find ways and means for the whole people to talk to each other. He was worried that one of the experiences of the founding generation was that everyone had a chance to begin, to write things new. And he says, well, if we start a constitution and let the experts govern, people are going to forget that. And we can't let them forget that. And so he made a proposal for this ward system, that everyone would be broken up into wards and they would have a place to talk. But that was what was missing from the American Constitution. And so she writes again, what eventually saved the United States from the dangers Jefferson feared was the machinery of government. The Federalists did succeed in creating a machinery of government that prevented factions from overwhelming the whole. But, she continues, this machinery could not save the people from lethargy and inattention to public business, since the Constitution itself provided a public space only for the representatives of the people and not for the people themselves. This was the real danger Arendt saw, that we would lose, that we have lost spaces of freedom, spaces of power, where people could get together and talk. And so she writes, the whole question of representation actually implies no less than a decision on the very dignity of the political realm itself. So I think what I'm trying to say here is that Madison and Hamilton and the founders said we need to avoid the dangers of democracy and we want to use representation. But Arendt said representation is a problem. It's an affront to the dignity of the political realm, because if you let representation replace people engaging in self-government, they will lose the dignity of being self-governing citizens. So the traditional alternative between representation as a mere substitute for direct action, she writes, of the people, and representation as a popularly controlled rule of the people's representatives over the people, constitutes one of those dilemmas which permit of no solution. No solution, right? What I'm trying to suggest here in this talk, and what I'm hoping this conference will begin to explore, is that I think civic assemblies are in many ways the lost space of freedom that Jefferson's talking about and that Arendt is talking about. It's a new way to create institutional spaces for the people to engage in the dignified act of politics. And one model for this is the jury. Sometimes these things we call civic assemblies are called civic juries. I like that term as an American political theorist because it speaks to the role of the jury, which we all here in the United States understand. And here I turn to Alexis de Tocqueville, who writes that the jury serves to communicate the spirit of the judges to the minds of all citizens. And this spirit, with the habits which attend to it, is the soundest preparation for free institutions. What Tocqueville understands is that if America failed to create a space for the people to discuss politics, which it did create a space for people to discuss right and wrong, the jury. And there is a habit in America for people to come together, everyday people, and discuss what we should do, right or wrong, who should be punished and who not. And that this creates a habit and a spirit of judging outside of your personal interest according to the law or what is right. And what citizen assemblies can do is provide a space for that to happen, and thus a habit for it to happen. They can thus resist what Arendt calls the crisis of representative government. She says, representative government is in crisis today partly because it has lost, in the course of time, all institutions that permitted the citizens' actual participation, and partly because it is now gravely affected by the disease from which the party system suffers, bureaucratization and the two parties' tendency to represent nobody except the party machines. It is in these new councils, these new citizen assemblies or civic juries, where we can find what Hannah Arendt calls the spaces of freedom. She writes, the councils obviously were spaces of freedom, councils where people came together and talked. Because when you talk, you express your viewpoint and people listen. That's called appearing in public. It's what makes you human for Hannah Arendt. And so the issue at stake, she says, was representation versus action and participation. The councils were organs of action. The revolutionary parties were organs of representation. And so what I'm trying to suggest, and I'm hoping again will be fleshed out over the next 2 days, is that what we need to think of today is these citizen assemblies as part of a self-government tradition of citizen action, of participation, a restoration and a revival of the American Republican tradition. That's not just American, that's happening around the world. We need to create new spaces of freedom. And so, to begin doing that, I'd like to begin the conference with our first keynote speaker, David van Rijbroek. I've had the pleasure for the last month of teaching a course with him to some amazing Bard students about how to create citizen assemblies for local government. And those students and the 3 mayors that we worked with and David will be presenting at the last panel of the conference on Friday afternoon. Today, David is going to speak about his own work. David has in many ways become the founding father of the Sortition movement or the civic assembly movement. I think it's fascinating that he has a Ph.D. in archaeology, as did David Graeber, another person I think is really important in these conversations. He's won many prizes for his work, the AKO Literature Prize, the Libris History Prize. He's written many books. His book on the Congo, The Epic History of a People, is an extraordinary book about colonialism. He has a new book that just came out this year. It's about to be translated into English. The rough English title translation, as I understand it, is Revolution, Indonesia, and the Origin of the Modern World. But what David is most known for is his work, or at least in our world, is most known for is his work on civic assemblies. And that started to some degree with his book Against Elections, The Case for Democracy, which has been translated into innumerable languages. And he has been one of the founders of the G1000 and many of the citizen assemblies organizations throughout Europe, and really become one of the spokesmen for citizen assemblies. Thrilled to have David here, and so please join me in welcoming David van Rijbroek.